How many folks love oysters? Excellent. How many people are willing to try them at least for the first time? If not, well, sorry. You'll eat tofu, but you won't try an oyster. Okay. I have two different size container oysters up here, okay? They're both the same thing. One is simply a wild caught from one area. The other is a wild caught from a different region. The size varies, right? You'll have small oysters, medium oysters, large oysters, and then you'll have what's called randoms or pieces. Randoms and pieces are naturally less expensive because they don't sort them and grade them. They take whatever they have left and they package it in one container. Very similar to crab meat. If you want the biggest and the best and the most perfect pretty oyster, then you have to pay for that. If you don't care what you're getting, if you're going to chop it up anyway, the randoms are much less expensive and it's the exact same product, okay? We are going to start with onion and some celery. We're going to turn this burner on and we're going to use a lot of butter in this. Now, everybody says you're going to saute a tiny little bit of vegetables in a whole lot of butter. Well, yeah, but then we're also going to use it to help flavor our bread and our other products when we add it to our stuffing, so it kind of balances out. We're going to start melting that down, and I did leave my butter out, so it did soften a little bit. Okay? We're using white onion, and when you're cutting white onion, let's get this out of the way. Let's move this to the back for a second. Always want to start by peeling your onion, cutting it in half, and leaving the little back notch on it, okay? That lets the onion hold itself together. And what you do is you take your knife and you go through everything but that very back little part of onion. As you go all the way across, it will hold it together for you so that when you go to chop it, you're not chasing onion all over your cutting board. Okay? By leaving that little back knot, it holds it all together, and now all you have to do is basically hold it down instead of trying to get all those little pieces together. As you cross cut it, it gives you a perfect dice every time, and it breaks all the way through. Now when you get to the back and it gets a little hard to hold on to, lay it down and then cut it across a few times, down to about where the stem would be, and then stand it back up and you can go across again. This way you can go across your ends, and that's all the waste you have left, is that tiny little bit of onion. Makes it easy. And that was a good onion, I'm not even crying.
Yeah, really.
Now with the celery, you want to take it down in thirds. So run it from end to end. And with this one, use your pinky and your thumb to hold it together, and your other fingers just kind of to hold it down. And as long as your knife touches that one knuckle, you'll never ever cut yourself, okay? Keep your hands rolled back, pinky's holding it in, and your knife on your knuckle. And as you're moving back, you move your pinky and your thumb together. And I promise you, as long as you can feel this blade on that knuckle, you'll never ever cut yourself. Unless you take your hand and go like this, okay? Keep it to where you can control it, and just go all the way across. And it will take practice to get them all uniform and all the same size, I understand that. But I still have all my fingers, okay? It's very, very important. Make sure that that touches. And as long as you can feel that, you're okay. Now, naturally, if you're using a serrated knife, or you're using a dull knife, or you're using one that you got 300 years ago, you're pretty much in trouble. But some of them are pretty poor. We can turn this down. Our butter's starting to melt. Now with our celery and our onions, what we're looking to do with this is make it soft, okay? You're looking for that smell to start coming out of them and for them to soften. The softer they get, naturally, the quicker they'll bake down. We don't need them to go too far. We're going to add it all in there. While we're waiting for this to start, again, we're using two different types of prepared oysters. For those of you who like oysters, do you like them in the shell or out of the shell? In? Raw or steamed? Not many people like them raw, huh? Anybody else raw? Who else has tried them and doesn't like them? Not many people, right? I love them now, actually. Oysters are as different as the states we have, okay? There are literally hundreds of varieties of oysters. And every single town or port or region that you can get them from, they have their own brand, their own variety, their own flavor. And every single one will taste different, okay? They will all taste salty because they come out of salt water. However, depending on what type of water they're in, depending on how warm the water is, depends on what the flavor is going to be. The colder the water, the sweeter the oyster will be. The calmer the water, the smaller and the more delicate it will be. So if you have a place where water doesn't move a whole lot, it's really kind of still, but it's still salt or brackish water, you'll have a really thin, small shelled oyster. If you have real rough currents and real hard tides, you're going to get a much harder shell, a much larger oyster. Tends to be more salty, okay? Again, the colder that you get them from, the sweeter they'll be. So if you get them from Maine, Canada, Nova Scotia, northern parts, northern Washington, they'll be really, really sweet. The further south they go, they tend to be more salty. They'll tend to be a little bit more chewy. All depends on what it is you're looking for and you like, okay? We use Chesapeake Bay oysters here as much as we can. However, they're very short seasoned. A lot of these, I'm not even sure where this one is. This is actually from South Bend, Washington, right? And this one is just wild caught USA. Actually, Pride of Virginia, I'm sorry. So that is a Virginia local. And they will have a slightly different taste. It's not enough to where it's going to be horrible or hazardous, but it will be enough to where if you eat them raw and you do it repetitively, you'll notice a difference. These are starting to soften. And again, we're going to cook these now, and then we're going to mix them in our stuffing, and then we're going to bake them again. So you're not trying to make them fully cooked. You're not having to make them completely done. Sorry, I forgot my other pot. I figured I might as well grab it while I was thinking of it. But you want to cook them down. Now with this, we're using poultry seasoning, rosemary, and thyme, okay? Just for basic seasonings. Poultry seasoning, naturally, that's what you're going to season your chicken with, or your turkey with on Thanksgiving. We want to make sure we put it in our stuffing. And rosemary and thyme are just good, hearty and rustic herbs that you can get. They're still fresh in most people's gardens, so they're accessible. They grow all winter long, so you have them through the seasons. You have them in winter, Christmas, holiday, things like that. Chicken stock or chicken broth, okay, they are the same thing. I don't know why we put stock. Thanks, Jess. Typo on my part, I guess. But chicken broth and chicken stock are the same things. They're downstairs in the store. If you don't want to buy it in the containers, it comes in a powder or a gel type base. It's actually called base. It's in a jar very similar to this one. This is a vegetable base. They have it in chicken, beef, ham, vegetable, seafood, shrimp, any flavor you can imagine. Okay, so they're all downstairs and they're in any grocery store. This is starting to simmer a little bit more, and those onions are starting to break down. And you should be able to start smelling them through the crowd, okay? It's not real strong, but you have some onions, a little bit of celery. We're going to add our oysters to this. And the reason we're going to do this is it's safer, okay? I love raw oysters. I eat them. I would put them in my mix raw, and if they don't cook all the way, it's not really that big of a deal. But for such a large crowd, for such a large quantity, what we're going to do is add them to it. And you can see they're still rather large, okay? That's the other reason we're going to cook them. We're going to steam them for a few minutes in with our items as we're sauteing them, and then we're going to chop them up. And the reason we're chopping them is just so that they get a more even consistency, even size, and so that one person doesn't bite into a whole big chunk of oyster. We want to break them down a little bit. Now we are pouring the juice in here as well because we want that flavor, that seawater, that saltiness to work into our dish. Once we put them in here, because this is hot, it shouldn't take very long for them to cook up, and then we'll move on to being able to chop them. These should be slightly smaller, okay? One's about a quarter, the other one's a large 50-cent piece. but they're all about the same size and they're pretty uniform. We'll add this last one. And that is 2 pounds, by the way. They are 8-ounce jars. And I'll leave one of each of these up here for anybody who wants to look at the jars. Ice machines, ice machines. We'll stir that around. Again, because that butter was hot and the liquid that had come out of the onions and celery was hot, they shouldn't take very long to cook up. We're just looking basically to get them about half or 2/3 of the way done, and then they're going to carry over and continue to cook as they get hot. Now this pot is starting to come back to a boil, okay? If you put cold items into a hot liquid, when it comes back to a boil, it's a pretty good indication that the products inside are starting to cook and they're about halfway done, okay? So once it actually comes up to a boil, we'll take our spoon and we'll pull those oysters off of there real quick and we'll chop them. And as we're pulling them off, anything you see that went in first that we can get out of there, like this one, that's mostly done. When you cut through it, if it's firm and it holds its shape, that's about what we're looking for. We're not chopping these up perfect. We're just going to chop them randomly. And if we have to, we can put them back in there just to keep them warm till we add it to the rest of our products. Get the sweet potato out of here. Now, instead of those onions, can you smell more oyster? No, not yet. It's kind of like a seafood or a clam smell. A good way to tell that they're almost done or that they are done. See how the fins have opened up on them? I don't know if you can see it on the camera. They're too small. What I will do is leave one up here so you can see it. As they cook, there's little layers inside each one as they open and close. As they cook, they'll open up and they'll start to spread. When you can see that on most of them, that's a good indication that they're fully cooked or almost fully cooked. The little ones have shrunk up, so they're not too bad, but those big ones that we put in there first, we want to make sure we get out and we get them chopped. If we pull some of our celery and onions out, it's not a big deal. We're going to add it all back together anyway. And if we were to just stir this real hard, we could probably break them down. But then you end up with oyster paste and oyster mush. You could, but some of them shrunk really quickly, so you don't need to. And you may end up with really small pieces then. By doing it afterwards, it's not going to shrink much more than what it is. So we kind of know. Like that one, we didn't do anything to, but we don't really need to cut it. It's already the size of a dime, and that's pretty good. This one, on the other hand, didn't shrink at all. And the longer you leave them in here, the more flavor it's going to pull out. If you cut them, you end up losing some of the juice ahead of time. Some of that salt water that was in the packaging liquid. All right, we got most of them out of there. And now they're out. Like I said, it's not science to chopping them. We're just going to cross-cut them just to randomly get them all somewhat uniform, all relatively bite-sized. And then they're going right back in that pot. We can turn that pot off because now they're hot. Who's cringing about oysters? Yeah, but lots and lots and lots of people eat them every year. Oyster stew, oyster chowder, oysters on a half shell. Oysters Rockefeller is probably the most common, most well-known oyster dish you can find. It's on every restaurant menu, high-end, classical French you can find. Now in there we have our juice from our oysters, our celery, our onions, and our butter. And in this bowl, I went ahead and I chopped up our bread. Now, stale bread, croutons, day-old bread, frozen bread, whatever you can find. The reason that the liquid on that recipe varies a little bit depends on how old your bread is, okay? Stuffing is made from stale bread, it always has been. It actually works better that way because you add more flavor into it. When you have a bread that's very moist and very fresh, it doesn't take in as much liquid as something that's very stale or very dry. So it tends to not have as much flavor, okay? Downstairs we have tons of varieties of bread. One of my most favorite that's down there is a bread called eche penne. And it is a roasted garlic bread. It comes in a loaf, and they actually have whole cloves of roasted garlic in the center of it. It's a bread that we bake about 8 minutes downstairs. It comes in par-baked, and then it only has a 1-day shelf life in our stores. So it's something that turns over very quickly. It's meant to be crusty on the outside, and it's very chewy in the center, right? And that's actually how it's supposed to be. For this purpose, that crusty outside works very well. Okay? The other bread that I chopped up in here was a cheese bread that I found downstairs, and then there was a little bit of white. Now it says 2 loaves. The loaves that I found downstairs are about this big, which is why I have 3 different varieties. We added them to it. It still gave us quite a bit. If it breaks into crumbs, if it crumbles, falls apart, it's not the end of the world. Okay? Now, we're going to pour our stuff right over top of this. And then we're going to add our season to it. Poultry seasoning, rosemary and thyme. We're going to add a little bit of salt and pepper. We'll probably do about a teaspoon of each. Okay. Now, real quickly, once you get that first in there, you want to mix it up a little bit and see how much more liquid your bread's going to hold. You want it to be wet, but you don't want to be able to pick it up and have it just running out of your fingers. You want it to kind of hold the moisture in. And I can see this is still going to take a little more. Now we are using chicken broth today. If you're going to put oysters in it, you might as well put chicken in it too. You could, however, use vegetables, vegetable stock, vegetable broth. For you vegans and vegetarians out there. But I guess you wouldn't put oysters in it anyway. Actually, vegetarians would because they eat oysters. They eat fish. I know there's like 3,000 types of vegetarian. We're going to add 1 box of this and see how much that absorbs. Remember, if you're going to use an entire box, punch a hole in it. And it automatically lets it drain without that glug, 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 splash, splash, splash. Okay? Naturally, that's only if you're going to use the whole thing. There's nothing worse than putting a hole in the bottom of it and realizing you only need half and flipping it back over and it leaking all over the place. So just be careful when you're doing that. Now with this, like I said, you want to mix through it real thoroughly and make sure that all your bread is wet. And it's going to kind of mash and smush a little bit, and that's a good thing. And let some of those larger chunks break down and break up. And once you know that it's in a consistency where you can almost make a dough ball, okay? That's about what you're looking for stuffing. You don't want it to be so compact that you can squish it and then hit somebody with it and not have it break apart. But you want it to be firm enough. You want it to be firm enough to where it'll hold its shape a little bit, okay? Now, once that's all mixed, I have a large baking pan this evening. We're going to put this in. Now with this, cooking times. Cooking times will vary, and I'll show you how they're going to vary. If you pack this in the bottom of a cooking pan or on a baking sheet, and it's only 1 inch thick, it's probably not going to take a half hour to cook, okay? You have to really watch what you're doing and what you're looking for. The thicker you get in your pan, naturally the longer it's going to take. By adding our hot liquid to this, it's already warm, okay? So that helps if you're doing it right away. Cut down on your cooking time because you're not taking something that just came out of the fridge and then has to heat up to 90 or 100 degrees and then go from there. This is already over 100 degrees.
You can make this ahead of time?
You could. You can make it ahead of time, put it in the refrigerator, and just throw it in the oven. Okay? Any of your stuffings you can do that with. You may have to adjust your moisture level a little bit when you come out of the refrigerator. Refrigerators are naturally designed to pull moisture out of things. They're condensing units, so you may have to add a little bit of liquid to it. But as long as you keep it wrapped tight in plastic and foil, plastic or foil, it should be fine. Now, a 9.5 by 11 pan, if you fill it to the top, is about what that time and temperature are for, okay? This pan is a little bit larger, but it's not quite as thick. No, that's actually bigger than that. That's about a 12 by 18. But this is also aluminum, so it's very thin. Okay. It's aluminum side, so it's very thin, and we're not going to cover it because it is already warm. So we're just going to put it in there, let it heat up, and then golden brown on top, and that's all we're really looking for. Okay. I did preheat my oven to 350. The stuffing will give you a different crust in a glass pan than it will in the aluminum pan. Right? If you use a glass pan, the way that it conducts heat is different, and your stuffing will actually be more brown around the edges, and it'll give you a different crust on it, to whereas the aluminum pan may stick a little bit more or have to use more grease for it. Flavor-wise, it will be very similar. It just depends on how you want it. A lot of people will actually take their stuffings in glass pans and then flip them out and serve them that way. And cut it down into slices or into squares or triangles or shapes. That's about the only upside to doing it.
What about dressing if you just make it and drop it on a cookie sheet, just like this?
You could take that dressing or any other dressing and just use an ice cream scoop and do it into individual servings. Muffin pans will give you the same little shape and size.
You could freeze them like individual portions like that.
You would bake them first.
Yeah, cook them first.
Bake them first in individual portions and then freeze them and use them later. What else? Yes, you can. Sausage stuffing is actually another very common use, something else that's coming back. Any type of sausage, you naturally know your own taste and your own flavors. Personally, I'd want to use hot sausage because everything hot is better. But mild sausage, ground sausage, either of them will work. Now with this, like I had said, we had gone and cooked our oysters and we cooked our celery and our onions. Okay, so we knew everything going into this pan was already done. So it was basically heat it up, get it to dry out, crisp a little bit on top and kind of brown. Excuse me. I don't know how well you can see the top and the color, but once you get to the back, you'll notice. It's just started to crisp a little bit. Okay, it's still got a little bit moisture to it. Nobody likes stuffing that tastes like you didn't put any water in to start. Okay, so you don't want to cook all the water out of it. We want to cook enough out to where it picks up the flavors and it's extra. Okay, it's got a light color to it. It's not real brown. By all means, leave it in there a little longer if you like it more done or more crispy. For me personally, that's about as long as I'm going to cook it. Right?
How long did you have it in there?
It was in there about, no. It was about a half hour. Okay? And you should be able to smell it too. Oh, look at you. She about got up and ran out of her chair.